Keisha Laurent's morning began before dawn, the humid Brooklyn air still heavy, as she stepped off the subway at Columbus Circle. Clutched in her hand was her cherished Italian-French dictionary, and slung over her shoulder, the battered black case containing her favorite 1844 Guadagnini violin, her constant companion in every hopeful audition and late-night rehearsal. By 7:30 a.m., she had navigated the grand marble lobby of the Metropolitan Opera House, its vaulted ceiling echoing with the distant thrum of stagehands, setting flats and tuning pianos. In the cavernous rehearsal room, polished oak floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. White-coated stage managers filed past, carrying scores and folding chairs. Keisha's pulse quickened as she swept into the waiting area, heart already dancing to the opening measures of Bizet's Carmen, the aria she'd chosen to showcase both power and nuance. Behind a long table sat the four judges, two stern-faced men in tailored suits, one woman whose lips never curved, and a younger man taking notes with clinical detachment. All were white. When her name was called, Keisha rose, smoothing the folds of her emerald green silk gown. She approached the grand piano at the room's center. With a deep breath, she launched into the prelude, her velvety mezzo voice rising rich and full, painting every phrase with the warmth of her Harlem gospel choir roots. The room fell silent, save for the measured pedal of the accompanist's left foot. As she transitioned into the lilting lyricism of the habanera, her tone shimmered with subtle breath control. Yet when she reached the aria's climactic high D, the judges exchanged glances. The final note trailed into an uneasy hush. Without a word, the head judge tapped his pencil against his score sheet and spoke in clipped tones. "Thank you, Ms. Laurent. Your timbre is pleasant, but your style feels too urban for our repertoire." The words struck like a slap. Keisha's stomach lurched as she heard "too urban" echoed in her mind, an indelicate verdict masked as artistic critique. She forced a polite nod, held the gaze of each judge in turn, then curtly thanked them and swept out of the room. Her emerald gown caught in the doorway's ornate molding. She paused, hand pressed to her chest, and felt the weight of every gospel Sunday and jazz club gig that shaped her voice. Outside, the humid air pressed against her skin as tears stung her eyes. A cluster of young sopranos and tenors emerged, congratulating one another. No one looked her way. Clutching the dictionary and violin case like lifelines, Keisha drew in a trembling breath. The world had just labeled her too urban for opera's hallowed halls. But she vowed then and there she would prove that her voice, forged in church basements and street corner showcases, belonged on every grand stage from Milan to Vienna. And she would not stop until La Scala itself recognized her truth. Under the cracked stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church in Harlem, Keisha Laurent transformed sanctuary into stage. The pews had long since been stripped of hymnals, and broken floorboards revealed the earth beneath, but to her, it felt hallowed. Armed only with a borrowed Steinway baby grand and a single microphone, she stepped into the makeshift spotlight, a shaft of late-afternoon sun slicing through a gap in the roof. She opened with the haunting opening of Puccini's Visi d'arte, her rich mezzo voice resonating against the raw brick walls. As the final pianissimo faded, she let the gospel chords of Amazing Grace bleed seamlessly into the melody, her lower register sliding into warm, spiritual inflections that brought tears to the eyes of the dozen white-draped candles flickering on the altar. Then, without pausing for applause, she launched into a jazz-tinged cadenza, scatting over the timpani of piano chords, her voice dancing with intricate runs that no traditional opera coach would ever dare teach. In the back row, music blogger Simon Hale, long skeptical of anything outside Eurocentric opera norms, scratched frantically in his notebook. He'd come expecting a gimmick. Instead, he witnessed a fusion so natural it felt inevitable. As Keisha sustained a flawless high A, her voice crackling with both classical precision and raw urban grit, he fumbled for his phone and pressed record. Around him, fellow bloggers and indie critics watched, jaws slack, as the audience, comprised of neighborhood gospel singers, beatboxers, white avant-garde musicians, and a scattering of curious arts patrons, rose in spontaneous ovation. Within hours, Simon's video was online. Mezzo-soprano from the Bronx electrifies Harlem church with opera-jazz fusion. Comments flooded in. A revelation. Her voice bridges two worlds. Why isn't this on the Metropolitan stage? Yet despite the viral buzz, tens of thousands of views by Dawn, the classical press remained silent. Established critics continued lobbying their editors for polite editorials on urban theater, while invitations from mainstream houses stayed stubbornly absent. But in the glow of her underground triumph, Keisha felt a fierce satisfaction. She had found an audience that heard every note of her truth, and she knew the world's grandest stages would soon have no choice but to listen. 2 months after her Harlem triumph, Keisha Laurent sat at her kitchen table beneath the warm glow of a single lamp, scrolling through emails on her laptop. Among the usual notices, upcoming fusion concerts, requests for private coaching, one subject line froze her blood. Invitation, La Scala Global Voice Discovery Competition. Opening the message, she read a brief formal letter from Teatro alla Scala's artistic director. They invited a select group of undiscovered talents to compete in a confidential semifinal round in Milan, with the promise that the ultimate winner would star in the 2026 season's lead mezzo role. No details of repertoire, no mention of her gospel opera fusion, just a discreet link to schedule her flight and a reminder to honor the non-disclosure agreement. Keisha's heart hammered as she absorbed the implications. The same storied house whose New York critics had dismissed her voice as too urban was now inviting her to audition on its home turf. She tapped accept with trembling fingers, then sank back in her chair, mind racing with excitement and nerves. A week later, she arrived at Malpensa Airport in crisp fall air, her emerald green dress replaced by a sleek black coat. A private driver whisked her through Milan's cobblestone streets to a discreet rehearsal space near Brera, its unmarked door opening onto a minimalist foyer. Inside, a lone assistant handed her a sealed envelope containing the competition repertoire, a mix of standard operatic arias, a contemporary commission, and one piece that defines your unique artistry. That evening, in the wood-paneled rehearsal hall of Teatro Lirico, 10 semifinalists, 7 classically trained sopranos and mezzo-sopranos, all white and groomed in European conservatories, stood in a rough semicircle. Each carried their sheet music and a sense of steely confidence. Keisha, clutching her fusion arrangement, felt like an interloper. A hush fell as the artistic director, flanked by 2 veteran white conductors, explained the rules. Each contestant would perform 3 selections, Verdi, the commission, and their personal piece, before a closed panel with no audience. The next morning, Keisha watched her competitors stride in and out of the small stage room, emerging either triumphant or crestfallen. When her turn came, she stepped onto the tiny platform beneath stark spotlights. For her Verdi aria, she sang with flawless classical technique. For the commission, a soaring modern piece, she delivered crystalline lines with perfect pitch. Then she paused, took a breath, and reclaimed her gospel opera fusion. The habanera, seamlessly woven into a jazz-inflected improvisation. Her voice filled every corner, its dual heritage blazing with conviction. As the final note faded, the examiners exchanged charged glances. Keisha's heart pounded as she gathered her scores and left the room, unsure if she'd crossed the invisible barrier. Back in the foyer, she overheard whispers, some mocking the urban cadenza, others praising her daring vision. That evening, she returned to her Milan hotel, nerves frayed but spirit alight, awaiting the semifinal results to be delivered under the same hush of confidentiality that had invited her here. The morning light in Milan slanted through high-arched windows of the Teatro Lirico's rehearsal hall, illuminating rows of gilded mirrors and the scarred parquet floor. Keisha arrived clutching her scores, her heart drumming with anticipation. She'd risen before dawn, run through warm-up exercises in her hotel room, and rehearsed her audition pieces until the memory had etched itself into muscle. Now she stepped onto the worn stage. 10 other semifinalists fanned out beside her, each clutching polished folders of music, their white-gloved accompanists poised at sleek grands. As the artistic committee filed in, 3 white conductors, a stern artistic director, and a hushed interpreter. Keisha noticed subtle glances cast her way. She'd overheard rumors of non-traditional flair being a disqualifier here, but she wouldn't let prejudice cloud her focus. When her name was called, she delivered her Verdi and contemporary arias with flawless technique, each phrase ringing clear in the hush. Then came the moment she dreaded most, the personal piece. Moments before she was to sing, Keisha's loyal accompanist, an Italian pianist sympathetic to her cause, whispered that his sheet music had been switched. The familiar chords of her gospel opera fusion were gone, replaced by an avant-garde score she'd never seen. Behind her, a rival singer smirked, and Keisha realized it was no accident. Someone was trying to sabotage her only weapon of distinction. Panic flared, but she forced herself to inhale, recalling every late-night rehearsal in Harlem, every note she'd shaped from church rafters to jazz clubs. She closed her eyes, counted the tempo in her mind, then stepped to the piano. With no sheet to guide her, she sang the opening of her arranged habanera by memory, dark, sultry lines woven into syncopated gospel riffs. As the pianist improvised graceful chords from cue notes, she tapped on his shoulder. Keisha leaned into her improvisation, painting each phrase with raw emotion and classical poise. When the final, soaring riff trembled into silence, the room held its breath and then erupted in stunned murmurings. One of the white conductors, eyes wide, scribbled furiously in his scorebook. In the foyer afterward, a slender white tenor named Luca intercepted her, offering his own score for the original arrangement. "They tried to break you," he said softly, "but you made it your masterpiece." His solidarity cut through the morning's chill, and Keisha felt a surge of gratitude. She was not alone. That evening, as she stood on a balcony overlooking Milan's red-tiled rooftops, Keisha read the private email summoning her to the final round at La Scala. The same judges who once derided her urban style had no choice but to acknowledge her brilliance. Beneath the fading sunset, she whispered a vow. She would carry this unexpected alliance and hard-won triumph onto the grandest stage of all, and show the world that opera's future belonged to every voice bold enough to change its tune. The morning of the semifinal dawned crisp and electric. Keisha Laurent arrived at Teatro Lirico before sunrise, stepping into a hushed foyer scented with old wood polish and fresh sheet music. A row of Steinways gleamed like sentinels under vaulted ceilings as nervous semi-finalists filed in, each one in immaculate evening attire, voices hushed into respectful rehearsal. Keisha smoothed her gown's emerald folds and felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. Backstage, the air crackled with anticipation. A line of anonymous music stands, each bearing a single scout-marked folder, stretched before a heavy velvet curtain. The artistic director, flanked by 2 white conductors and a visiting mezzo-soprano coach, offered stiff nods as he passed. Their eyes were somber, unreadable, nothing like the warm smiles she'd known in Harlem. When her turn came, Keisha stepped onto the small raised platform. The hall's acoustics swallowed her slightest breath, and in the silent pause before her first note, she remembered every sacrifice. The late-night subway rides, the empty pantry nights, her mother's whispered prayers. Then, with a steady exhale, she began her first Verdi selection, her mezzo voice unfurling pure and rich, each vowel sculpted with classical precision. The panel listened, scribbling notes, but Keisha felt no judgment, only the living connection of music. Next came the contemporary commission, an angular modern area that tested tonal boundaries. Keisha navigated its dissonant leaps with fearless clarity, her voice gliding through unexpected chromatic twists. A hush fell over the judges, a recognition that here was an interpreter who could inhabit both tradition and innovation. Finally, the moment of truth, her signature gospel opera fusion. She took one silent breath, closed her eyes, and let the melody flow from her soul. The familiar habanera theme rose first in velvet classical tones, then blossomed into a gospel riff, her lower register rolling with warmth before spiraling into jazz-inflected ornamentation. She improvised melodic flourishes, each note alive with her Harlem gospel past and her Italian training. As the last resonant chord faded, the chamber hung suspended in awe. The judges exchanged charged glances. The white conductor's pens paused mid-scribble. The artistic director's stern mask softened. Then, one by one, they rose, their applause rolling through the hall like a thunderclap. Backstage, Keisha's heart thundered as the artistic director approached, extending a firm hand. "Complimenti, signora. Laurent," he said, voice warm. "You have earned your place in the La Scala final." In that moment, her signature piece still echoing in the air, Keisha knew she had conquered every doubt, silenced every critic, and secured her destiny on the world's grandest operatic stage. Night had fallen over Milan when Keisha Laurent stepped through La Scala's grand bronze doors, the city lights flickering on the wet cobblestones like 1,000 tiny stars. Inside, the opulent foyer was awash in crystal and velvet. Gold leaf balconies soared overhead, and marble statues lined the walls. Keisha's heart pounded as she ascended the sweeping staircase, her emerald gown trailing softly behind her, every step echoing in the hushed grandeur. Backstage, the hushed murmur of musicians tuning their instruments filled the air. The conductor, a distinguished white maestro with silver hair, offered Keisha a reassuring nod. She leaned in, whispering, "This is our moment," and he smiled, raising his baton in encouragement. When the house lights dimmed, a hush rippled through the packed auditorium. The red velvet seats stretched out below her like waves, filled with Milan's cultural elite. Opera aficionados in black tie and gowns, white critics perched in gilded boxes, and a smattering of journalists. The orchestra struck the opening chords of Berlioz's overture, its swelling brass and tremolo strings reverberating off the frescoed ceiling. Stepping into the spotlight, Keisha drew a deep breath. The first notes of her Verdi aria rang out pure and resonant, her mezzo register enveloping the hall. Her voice soared effortlessly over the orchestra, every phrase sculpted with crystalline clarity. At the aria's soaring climax, she held a perfect high BB, the note hanging in the air before melting into the hushed accompaniment. Midway through the second act's featured scena, Keisha surprised the audience. As the score wound toward its traditional cadenza, she paused, inhaled the warm air, and wove in a subtle gospel riff, soft at first, then blossoming into full-throated improvisation. The orchestra seamlessly echoed her syncopated rhythms, creating a dialogue between Puccini's lush harmonies and her Harlem-inflected soul. For a heartbeat, the gilded hall was filled not just with opera, but with raw, spiritual truth. As she transitioned back to the written score, the audience sat in stunned silence before erupting into a thunderous ovation. The chandeliers shimmered as hands clapped in unison, not in polite admiration, but in full-bodied celebration. White critics in the boxes, once wary, stood and joined the applause, their stoic facades giving way to genuine awe. Keisha took her bows, one deep curtsy after another, tears of triumph glinting in her eyes. Backstage, the white tenor who had befriended her embraced her, whispering, "You've done the impossible." The conductor clasped her hand, beaming with pride. Later, as she stood on La Scala's empty stage, now bathed in the soft glow of footlights, Keisha closed her eyes and let the echoes of "Bravo" wash over her. In that timeless moment, she knew she had not only conquered an iconic house, but had forever changed its heart, proving that the most urban of voices could resonate in even the grandest of opera's cathedrals. In the weeks that followed her electrifying debut at La Scala, Keisha Laurent's name became synonymous with a bold new direction in classical music. International journalists clamored for interviews. The Guardian sent its culture correspondent to Brooklyn to trace her roots. Le Figaro filmed her coaching masterclasses in Paris, and the New York Times ran a front-page profile titled, "From Harlem to Milan, the mezzo who rewrote opera's rules." Keisha's voice, once deemed too urban, now resonated in headlines from Tokyo to São Paulo. Major houses that had once slammed their doors now vied for her signature. Covent Garden offered her Carmen, the Vienna State Opera extended a multi-year contract, and the Metropolitan Opera in New York invited her to inaugurate its fall season in Don Carlo. Yet amid the whirlwind of red carpet galas and glittering benefactor dinners, Keisha remained focused on her greater mission to open opera's doors for every unheard voice. Drawing on the solidarity that had lifted her through sabotage in Milan, she founded the Urban Arias Initiative, a mentorship and scholarship program based in Harlem. In the vaulted space of a repurposed church-turned performance hall, she welcomed young singers of all backgrounds for free weekly workshops, technique clinics led by white and non-white opera stars, gospel-inflected masterclasses with jazz legends, and career development seminars taught by agents and casting directors who once dismissed her. Under her guidance, dozens of talented voices, from R&B crooners to church choir soloists, gained acceptance into prestigious conservatories worldwide. That spring, Keisha returned to La Scala, not as a competitor, but as its first ever artist in residence, representing a fusion series called Bridges of Song. Each program paired Puccini and Verdi with gospel, jazz, and contemporary chamber music, performed by a rotating ensemble of diverse singers and instrumentalists. The series sold out immediately, and critics marveled at how seamlessly her curated repertoire spoke to both tradition and innovation, forging a path for audiences who had never believed opera could speak to them. On opening night of Bridges of Song, Keisha stepped onto the stage one last time, not as the outsider fighting for a chance, but as the visionary shaping opera's future. The final strains of her signature gospel opera cadenza rose and fell beneath a standing ovation that transcended color, creed, and convention. As the chandeliered hall shimmered with shared exhilaration, Keisha looked out at a generation of young singers, white, black, brown, eyes alight with possibility. In that triumphant moment, she knew her journey had become their roadmap, proof that when courage meets artistry, even the most hallowed traditions can be transformed, and a single voice can open every stage to the world.